Hey physics peeps, we're going to talk about graphing. It's going to be awesome. So when we graph in class, there's a lot of times we're going to be graphing out data that we collect in lab. And it could be in a virtual lab or a hands-on lab that we do. But as we're graphing out, there are some things that we need to keep in mind and things that we need to make sure that we're doing consistently, because really it's going to come down to using our graph and being able to interpret the information that we collected. And so that's going to be the big use for us and what we want to get to. We're going to go over that. This is going to be split up into two parts though, because when we talk about graphing, we are going to be putting the graph together with labels, titles, the number scale, and actually plotting out our data. And then the other part is going to be drawing trend lines, finding slope, all that kind of good stuff. Okay? But to set this up, we're actually going to take a sheet of paper and we're going to write our name up at the top. And you're going to want to save this sheet of paper because it's going to be something that you'll turn into your fill. Okay? But we're going to set up our graph like this green line. So you'll have a vertical green line or vertical line and then a horizontal line on your paper. Kind of like on a regular graph that you might use in math class. But something to avoid is actually making a graph that looks like this, where you have those 4 different quadrants or 4 different spaces. We're not going to use that. Instead, we just want vertical line, horizontal line. You want that to take up about half the sheet of your paper so that you'll have enough space to put in all your data and all the other things that you need. Okay? Make sure that you keep some space though along the sides, the top, and the bottom, because then we're going to put some more information in there. So feel free as we go through this, if you need to pause the video, you need to rewind it, you can always do that, because I'm going to try to work through it pretty quickly. And then by pausing and restarting the video, you can go at your pace that works well for you. So here we go. And so the first part is putting in things like our labels and units. And we're going to take this one thing at a time. Okay? But to do that, we're going to set up our graph. We need stuff to graph it out. We need data. So where are we going to get our data from? Well, we can get our data from something that you actually did before. Something that you did back here in Pivot Interactives, like this little bowling ball example. You guys found that there were different tools that you could use, like the ruler and the stopwatch, and when you start the video, the ball can roll to different distances, and this little stopwatch actually records the time that it took to get to that position. And so those are going to be 2 things that we're going to record: the position of the ball and the time it took to get there. Okay? Keep in mind, remember that this is recorded with a high-speed camera, and so it says the 60 frames per second, or that's what the FPS means, and you can move the ball to different positions and you can record what time it was when it got there. And then you can move it to a different position and record what time it got there. You'll actually be doing this later on your own in other labs. And so this is going to be something that will come in handy. Okay? But when we record this stuff, here we go. We can actually go to all those different positions and record times. And we might end up with data that looks like this. We have positions that we record at different places, and then times when it got there. Notice that though it's not all super clean, like goes 10, 20, 10, 15, 20, 25. There's like little jumps in here. And that'll, you'll see how it plays out later. Okay? But when we make our graph, like we said before, first thing, we need labels with units. We need to actually know what we're graphing out. Your graph has 2 sides to it, an x-axis and a y-axis. You need to know where they are. The x-axis, x is horizontal, it's along the bottom. I'm going to label that over here on the end with an x at the end. I want you to do that on your graph. Okay? The y-axis, y is vertical, and so the y-axis goes up and down I'm going to label it there. I want you to put that on your graph. Okay? These things, the position and the time, the position of the ball, the time it took for the ball to get to a different spot, we're going to put those on the axes as well. But which axis they go on, we'll talk about how you know which one goes where. For what we do, most of the time goes on the x-axis. And so we're going to label that down here. And we're going to put time on the bottom of the x-axis. We can't just have the label or like just say time. We also need a unit because this has a unit up here as well. It's measured in seconds, so we put seconds down on the bottom. Next, we're going to label the y-axis. The y-axis, we're going to list our positions. So I'm going to label that along the side here, position. But I can't just have the word position, I also need a unit. It was measured in centimeters, so I'm going to label centimeters. So that's our labels with units on the x and y axis. Next thing we're going to do is the title. And the title of the graph goes up at the top. But the title is very specific, and I want you to make sure that you have this down. We say that the title of the graph is always something versus something, but it goes in a particular order. It's always what's on the y-axis versus the x. It's y versus x. You need to know that. And so when we label it, this isn't actually the title, y versus x. The title is whatever is labeled on the y. Well, on our y-axis, we actually labeled the position. So we started off position versus whatever's labeled on the x-axis. In this case, it's time. You don't need units up in your title, but our titles always go y versus x. And so in this case, it's position versus time. That's it. Make sure you have that on your graph. Awesome. So we got the title. And now the next part is we're going to create a number scale along the sides, things that we can plot things out. Some things to keep in mind though is that we're going to start each one of them at 0, and then we're going to create a pattern that we can use to kind of plot our data out later with. And so when we say it starts at 0, it's really down here in the corner. It's the origin of the graph. We're going to start both axes from 0. Even though our data doesn't start at 0, that's okay. For our purposes, it's just a lot easier when we interpret the graph. And there's some funky things that tend to happen that when people start at something other than 0, that it really kind of makes it difficult to interpret. And so we'll see how that plays out. Okay? Next thing though, we need to create a scale along each axis that we can actually plot out our data. We're going to start with the position because our numbers here are a little more easy to use. We have things like 10, 15, 20, 40, all that kind of stuff. But when we plot out our data, we can't actually do like 10, 15, 20, 40. We have to go up by an even pattern starting from 0. So we could do something like 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 2, 4, 6, 0, 3, 6, 9, 0, 5, 10, 20, all that, or 0, 5, 10, 15, things like that. It has to be even, and it has to be even the whole way. We're not skipping stuff like 20 to 40. And so if we want to do this, we could go up by tens. We just want to make sure that our data, it's all represented on our graph, and that it takes up a good chunk of the graph and not just a little bit. So if we do go up by things like 10, we could do something like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. Oh yeah, my highest point, it goes up to 60. I could do that. If you wanted to go up by 5s, you can do that. You just have to make sure that your tick marks kind of fit in there in the right spots, all that kind of stuff. Okay? So that's scaling out the y-axis. The x-axis is a little more difficult because you have really small numbers. Remember that this was taken with that high-speed camera, so that's why they're so small. But it's also really difficult, like what are you actually going up by in order to scale it out? Well, we'll take a look at data like this throughout the year, and so this will be something that you can do, and that's a little bit of a trick. Instead of looking at the entire digit or the entire number that you are given, try crossing out the last two parts or two digits that are in that number. And when you do that, you end up with still decimals, but it's something that's a little easier to look at and find a pattern. You have 0.09, 0.15, 0.19, 0.40, 0.45, 0.51, 0.55, 0.60. Well, instead of going up by like, again, we can't do 0.09, 0.15, 0.19, we can't do that. We can go up by something maybe like, we go up by 0.10, 0.20, and do it that way. We can actually get something that's fits our data a little better. But again, oops, I'm going to spread this out. When I actually create this data or trend scale, I do want to spread out my data. I don't want it to take up just a little bit. It needs to take up at least half of the space that I have in my graph. And it's, again, just for us to make sure that we can actually read it correctly and interpret it. So if I do like 0.10, I'm going to do that there. And then 0.20, 0.30, 0.40, 0.50, 0.60. 0.60 is the highest number that I got to on the data, so that's really all I have to go up to when I plot it out. Try to make sure that these are evenly spaced, and then you should be good. Okay? So, we started at 0, we evenly spaced everything out, and then it fit our data, and it took up at least half of the graph. Now we get to the fun part of actually plotting out our data points. So each data point, we can come back to our data, and we can plot out our x and y's. You just got to make sure that you keep things straight of where your x is and where your y is. So when you see something like 0.0995, down here on the x-axis, we don't actually see 0.0995. But 0.0995, that's really close to 0.10 or 0.1. So I'm going to kind of start there. And then I'm going to follow it up until I get to my y position, which is 10. And my data point is going to meet where those two things cross. So that's my first data point. My second data point is going to be 15 and 0.1540. Again, I don't see 0.1540 on here, but 0.15, again, if I kind of look at this, it's a little easier. 0.15, oh, that's between 0.10 and 0.20. Okay. I'm going to follow that up until I get to 15. Where those meet, that's my second data point. I'm going to keep doing that with all of these. And when I do that, I magically end up with something that might look something like this. So notice that when I made all these data points, I'm trying to follow what this is. I'm trying to plot out my x, find my x position, and then try to find my y position. I follow it up until I get to where that is. And so you do that with all the data points. This ends up looking really nice. Notice that there's a little gap here, and there's a gap there because really we had a gap in our data too. We went from 20 to 40. Okay? So what I want you to do is make sure that you have a graph that looks like this. You have a title, you have the scaling on the side, you have things labeled, you have the data points. Make sure that you know how to get that. Next video, we're going to talk about trend lines and slope. See you in a little bit.